It's been almost 3 years, or as of this summer, it'll be 3 years since the U.S. military left Afghanistan. That moment forced us to remember that the U.S. had been at war for 20 years, the longest war that America has engaged in our history. Unusual for us in the United States. In fact, you could say it's kind of a habit, which is what our authors are going to talk about tonight. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me anymore, but they've calculated that since 1776, the U.S. has engaged in something like 400 military interventions, something like that. But over half of those, shockingly, since World War II, which really took me aback, and 29% of those since the Cold War, which is sort of a surprise. We're quite used to this by now, and it has led us into a new phase that our authors are calling kinetic diplomacy. But what are the risks of that if we truly are fully in that phase? And what does this mean about a self-perpetuating cycle of this kind of activity and the risk of, as our title would have it, or the gospel, if you will, literally dying by the sword? So on that cheery note, I want to say good evening and welcome to tonight's Chat and Chowder. My name is Mary Eintema, and whatever the notes say, very glad to see you tonight at World Boston. I'm the president of World Boston, and we're so happy that you are with us, whether in the room or on the Zoom. Before we get started, as usual, a couple of reminders. As you may know, our mission is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So we thank you for taking part in this mission. Right away, we thank our hosts at Foley and Lardner for their kind hospitality. And I want to shout out my colleague, Natalie Mace, our Director of Global Engagement Programs, who is doing everything to make this event happen, along with other great World Boston colleagues. So World Boston board members and staff members, raise your hands, go talk to them. They know a lot and they're really great people. Of course, we thank the Lowell Institute, which generously supports Chat and Chowder and Great Decisions, as well as our annual State of the State Department. You heard it here first, June 25th. Mark your calendars. The Lowell Institute support makes it possible for all of these programs to be free of charge to you, but that does not mean free of cost to any of us. So we really hope that you will take the opportunity to donate $25 or more. You will get one of these very stylish pins and help support these wonderful events. Shout out to Jan Murray and John Driscoll, who just jumped in and hopefully have got their pins. You can make a tax-deductible contribution anytime to World Boston. You all have QR codes on your tables, and they're very exciting, and you should enjoy them in the appropriate fashion. So next, upcoming events. We are busy. Next week, we've got two on Monday, April 29th. We hope to see you at the Boston Public Library for Great Decisions. We're covering the U.S.-China trade rivalry. Very excited to host Wendy Cutler from the Asia Society, and she'll be in conversation with our own World Boston board member, Leslie Griffin. Then on Thursday, come on back here for Chat and Chowder again. We'll host Harvard historian Calder Walton with his new book, Spies, the Epic Intelligence War Between the East and West. So hope to see you for all of the above and more into June and beyond. Again, have a look at worldboston.org. Finally, a note on housekeeping. When we turn to audience Q&A, please raise your hand and I will recognize the next person with a question. Someone will bring a mic to you so you can ask your question, which ends with a question mark. Yay. We will try to take several questions also from Zoom, and we'll have a colleague read them out. So put your questions into the Zoom Q&A box. All right, at long last, back to this room and what we're doing now. We are thrilled to be joined by Sidita Kushi and Monica Duffy Toft, from two, by the way, excellent World Boston partner organizations, Bridgewater State and Fletcher. Very happy about that. I'm going to abbreviate these impressive bios, but have a look at worldboston.org. Dr. Kushi is an assistant professor of political science at Bridgewater and a non-resident fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at Fletcher, where she previously led the Military Intervention Project, about which I have a feeling we'll hear more. She teaches on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, globalization, global governance, and quantitative methods. Her next book is coming out soon. The national interest, from Kosovo to Darfur, Why Humanitarian Militarism Favors the West, is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. Monica Duffy Toft is academic dean, professor of international politics, and director for the Center for Strategic Studies at Fletcher. Before joining Fletcher, she taught at Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government and at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. While at Harvard, she directed the initiative on religion. In international affairs, and was the assistant director of the John M. Owen Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Toft's recent books include Securing the Peace, Political Demography, and God's Century. So let's get right to it. Sidita and Monica, thank you so much for joining us at World Boston tonight.
Thank you. It's our pleasure to be here, and we look forward to discussing our book's empirics, theories, and policy recommendations with you this evening.
And thank you, Mary, and thank you to the sponsors of this event. Sidita and I have been working together for about now 6 years on this project, and the book, which is up here, showcased before you, and I think there's some available for purchase, really does try to capture sort of the play of American politics, in particularly American national security policy, over the past couple of 100 years. And I have to say, when we started the project, we didn't know where the data were going to take us. We didn't know what the data were going to tell us. Nobody had done a project like this before, trying to codify every instance of U.S. intervention since the founding of the country. And when the data started coming and emerging, it was very exciting for us, but as you'll see, a little bit depressing. And I should say the cover of the book, Sidita and I are really proud of the cover because, first of all, I'm a native New Yorker, and I happened to have dressed as the Statue of Liberty. I was the president of my high school class, and I was on the float, and I was the Statue of Liberty. On top of that, I was a Slavic languages major, and Kafka was one of my favorite authors. And that cover is from his book, America. On top of that, Sidita is from an immigrant family, and the Statue of Liberty, of course, welcomed. So for us, when we saw this cover, we were really drawn to it and thought it was extraordinarily important for us to have it as our cover. So we talk about this imperative of kinetic diplomacy. And the idea here is that we've become too committed to the pointy end of the spear and forgot about other tools of statecraft. So you can think about economic statecraft. I'm at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where you think about diplomacy, which is not for your friends, it's actually for your opponents. And we've forgotten about diplomacy as a tool of statecraft, to the point where we get into a crisis and we feel as if all we have left is to use force. We think that has big implications with the idea of using force first and not thinking about diplomacy, not thinking about other potential tools of statecraft. So the central questions when we started the project is America a bully, right? Is it going around the world with pointy elbows, sort of compelling other states to do things because we have the power, the military power, right, to do it? But we also have soft power. So I don't know if Joe Nye has ever spoken. I'm sure he's come to one of your talks, but Joe Nye coined this term soft power. And the United States has that and had that in spades, right? So we could be a soft power bully, but we choose to be a hard power bully. And what's distressing about that is somebody who works and has always worked at schools of public policy and advises the US government is that how effective has this been as a policy? Is it actually achieving our national security interests? Are our tax dollars, I'm an American citizen, I'm a US Army veteran, right? Are my tax dollars, are my fellow troops being used in the service to advance US national security interests? So we wanted to answer that question. And as the Goliath, David and Goliath, think about the sling and the spear, right? The sling and the stone. Are we actually achieving what we want to achieve? And should we care about it as citizens? And we're going to give you some data. So the argument we make is that the U.S. has become more militarized. We have an over-reliance on the use of force around the world, minimal support for diplomatic efforts. We can talk about the U.S. State Department. It's never gone above 5.6% of spending of the Department of Defense. Think about that. Department of Defense is always multiple times the size of the U.S. State Department. And in the current era, we don't really have a national security strategy, right? We're going to go very quickly through prior eras about that. And so at a time, you know, when the United States, you could make the argument that we were quite secure. We could have had that moment to develop a strategy, but we chose not to. So you can go to the next slide. So we look at sort of the data, we're looking at arcs of history and trying to synthesize sort of a broader narrative to explain what was going on. It's data driven. We have some grand strategy narratives through time to try to figure out how we should be thinking about U.S. statecraft. So we think about the founding of this great nation, right? It is a great nation, it's a great state. Independence from Britain, we were the first movers. We were the beginning of the end for the British Empire. Right. Then we conquered the Great Frontier, which wasn't so pretty for the indigenous population of this country, right, spanning east to west. But we stayed within the borders of the country. Then thinking about the war to end all wars, right? This is World War I. Didn't work so well. In fact, I'm doing a lot of work right now in the interwar period from 1920 basically to 1935. Then we wanted to defeat the Axis powers. That was what we were committed to at that period. Then thinking about preventing World War III, we had the Soviet Union. I'm a Cold Warrior. I was a Russian linguist in the U.S. Army. And we were seriously committed and we needed to defend against the Soviet Union. It was a hostile power to the United States. And then thinking about leading a new world order in 1989, 1991, depending upon when you code it, the Soviet Union collapsed and we emerged triumphant. That should have been a glorious moment in our country's history. Where we can really think about strategically where we want to be, who we want to be as a nation. But then 9/11 happened. And we had a complete reorientation of our U.S. foreign policy. The president has an executive order, the AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, where basically it's been a he, can go wherever he wants so long as part of the global war on terror. And so then today, where we're left with this era of kinetic diplomacy, the idea of the use of force. So if you look in our book, these are chapters in the book. We talk about the America, you can read through that, America the expander, America the Western hegemon. We had no competitors in the region. Then the hesitant helper, we were a little bit isolationist in this period. We did not want to get involved. And then we realized that anytime war comes to Europe, we have to get involved. And then being the leader of the free world, a unipolar hegemon, moving on to America, pardon me, the unleashed. So current US strategy, pardon me, one hammer, many nails. So does anybody know what this pad is? Anybody, students of US foreign policy?
Who have not yet read the book.
Who have not read the book. It opens the book. Well, what then? Well, yeah, we have a hand. Oh, yeah. So what is that?
Well, we can't hear you without a
John Bolt, notes.
Yeah, John Bolton notes on. Go ahead.
On, okay, I gotta be honest, I forget who we planned to invade with the 5,000, but anyway, it was Venezuela, there you go.
Venezuela wasn't doing things that we were happy with. John Bolton's, Trump's national security chief, writes on this yellow pad, gets caught by some, photographer, journalist. And this is what we're gonna do. This is how we're going to solve the Venezuela problem. We're going to send troops to Colombia, right? And so it's more reactionary. We're not thinking out. We're not thinking out strategically. And I talk about anybody go to the circus or to fairs, and you whack a mole, and a problem pops up, and you whack that problem down. So I'm going to turn to Sidita now. She's going to go through the data, and then we'll go to why we think this really matters. So Sidita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Monica. So I will walk you through the empirical component of our book. Before I do that, just a little bit of context on how we collected our data. This is where that military intervention project comes back to haunt us a bit. It was a project through the Fletcher School CSS Center for Strategic Studies under Monica's leadership. And the approach was we wanted to collect every single instance of the US military usage of force abroad since the founding of the country up until the modern day. And that includes the frontier wars, because yes, indeed, the 100+ American Indian nations were foreign actors that the US did militaristically intervene against. So we wanted to incorporate that in our data set and book, and as well as drone warfare and covert operations. So the military intervention project is the basis of this book, Dying by the Sword. Not only do we attempt to collect the most comprehensive data set of US military interventions abroad since the country's founding, but we include documentation for every single one of these data sources. So you have the data, but you also have case narratives, over 300, 400 case narratives of every single military intervention we have. And of course, the numbers are going to be underreported. Keep that in mind. In our military intervention project, which plays a key role in this book, we have found almost 400 US military involvements since the founding of the country, most of them 1800s onward. Okay? And about 200 of those interventions have occurred after World War II. And what's even most surprising is that about 100 of them have occurred in the post-Cold War era. And that's surprising because in the post-Cold War era, we had a direct rival. We had a direct, vital geopolitical security threat. So although US foreign policy during the Cold War era was far from perfect, far from pacifistic, there was a clear grand strategic vision at play. However, how can we explain those 100+ interventions after the Cold War, an era of peace and stability for the United States? That is really what piqued our curiosity as part of this book. And about 72 of those interventions have happened after 9/11. And the region has shifted from Latin America and Europe to North Africa, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa in the 2000s. And those are important geopolitical shifts for the US and the world at large. 77 interventions have been in the Middle East and North Africa. Thank you. I will summarize some key trends before I show you those key trends graphically. The first trend that we note in our book is that the frequency of US military interventions has increased throughout the eras that we discussed. But you might wonder, the eras have different years. Certain eras are lengthier than others. So what's really interesting is that rate of intervention. We have found that the rate of US military interventionism has doubled during and then after the Cold War. The rate of US military interventionism has accelerated following the end of the Cold War instead of either staying steady or decreasing. We've also found through our military intervention project, where we do have a measure of geopolitical national interests, the US is intervening now in pursuit of lower traditional geopolitical interests than it once did. So now we are going back to this idea of what is our grand strategic vision? What does the next era hold for US key priorities, both domestically and globally? Where is that money going to, for what purpose? Not only has US frequency of intervention increased, not only has the rate increased across the eras, but its hostility levels have increased as well. To attempt to be the most comprehensive data set out there, we measure intervention on a level of hostility, from no intervention to outright war. But there are middle grounds. A display of force, a direct usage of force, or a threat of force are also military interventions. And we have seen that the US has gotten quicker to jump to a display of force or a direct use of force, as opposed to a threat of force or no force included. Perhaps diplomacy instead, in lieu of a direct resort to force. We've also seen that in the post-Cold War era, the US has changed its military objectives, and it has intervened more so as a third-party actor in ongoing disputes, especially in the post-Cold War era. And as Monica said earlier, this whole time, DoD budgets have remained high while DOS, Department of State, and diplomatic budgets have remained at the highest, only 5% of the DoD budgets. So we see that while military interventionism increases in frequency and rate, that funding for the DoD also increases, and DOS funding does not. Here are some beautiful graphs, I hope. So this is what I'd like to introduce you with at first. US military intervention frequency by year, by number, and color-coded for region of the world. What's the first thing you notice? Anyone? You see a steady cyclical increase, right? There is a little bit of a jump, it dips back down, but the next jump is a little bit higher, and then it exponentially increases a bit. And you also notice the graph gets more colorful as we progress further. And that's because the US goes from a pretty small power to a regional hegemon intervening within its Western hemisphere to a global hegemon after World War II, intervening everywhere in the world. And you see that in the 2000s, pink shows up there. That's sub-Saharan Africa. Very new region for us, historically speaking. And here are the number of US interventions by region, by era. You see here that in the 1800s until the early 1900s, most US interventions were in the Western Hemisphere, Latin America. Makes sense historically, makes sense in terms of US objectives and Western hegemony. And then after World War II, very colorful. The US intervenes everywhere. Interventions by objective. So why has the US been intervening according to their own military mandate? So these are the basic beginnings of the objectives of the interventions. As you see here, that economic interventions, especially in the very beginning of US statehood, were dominant, protecting commercial interests in Latin America and so on. And then you see that protecting our own was also a very key strategic objective, getting US citizens out of unstable regions, getting them out and closing up, embassies. And then, especially during the 90s, we have socially protective interventions, sometimes called humanitarian interventions. The US intervening in pursuit of protecting ethnic, religious, or minority groups as per the mandate. Remember how I said that the US has increased its hostility levels? As you see in this pie chart, most of the time the US has either displayed force or used force as part of these interventions. In very few occasions has it threatened force, and luckily, very few occasions have we had outright war. A really interesting main finding that we see is that the US has increased its interventions while at the same time increasing its hostility levels. So it's both the frequency and the hostility of the interventions that we're concerned about. What we're really concerned about is after 9/11. This is a graph of the highest military action undertaken on average by the US in comparison to its state B disputant. And as you see, at one point, they were evenly matched. What happens next, though? That gap. Disputants are lowering their hostility levels while the US has increased theirs. That's what we're truly concerned about. We're also concerned that the US no longer has a clear, solid, grand strategic vision. What are our national interests today? Is it democratization? Is it human rights promotion? Is it anti-terrorism? Is it making sure a rival great power doesn't usurp our global hegemony? We haven't truly decided. And it shows in the fact that we are pursuing intervention for local geopolitical interests in recent eras. This is an average national interest index from low to high, and I'd be happy to talk more about how we measured that in the Q&A. But since the 90s, national interests are on average lower for U.S. interventions than there have been in previous eras. Back to Monica.
Okay, so the question is, why should we care? And I'm wondering, can one of you just bring me another bottle of water? I seem to have a tickle. So first is, it's clear that we're ramping up the use of force at a time when its use is most limited. So I'm quickly going to go through this. I don't know if you recognize these two photos side by side, but the one on the left is Vietnam, happened, early 1970s. The one on the right is Afghanistan, looks very similar. The question is, why didn't we learn, right? It's very difficult today to fight counterinsurgencies, wars, right? It's a riskier environment. In fact, data from my husband, who's written a book called How the Weak Win Wars, tracks over time how it is that our adversaries, that, by the way, these are ratios of 10 to 1 to power based on population and economics. And in the 19th century, our adversaries, our weaker adversaries, chances are we were going to defeat them 9 to 1, 7 to 1. By the 20th century, it drops to 6 to 1, 65% to 35% chance of winning. And it's 50-50 now. Chances of defeating an adversary, a much weaker adversary. Why is that? Well, he traces it to two things. One is guerrilla warfare. Large states are not very good at guerrilla warfare or asymmetric warfighting. And second is nationalism. Nationalism comes into play in the 1850s, and it really takes hold by the early part of the 20th century, which gives rise to decolonization. And it's very difficult to defeat insurgents, defeat people who are fighting for their homelands, fighting for their homes. So one is it's not working. The second is that if you poll Americans, and we have polling that goes back, Gallup does it, a bunch of polling companies, it's not what Americans want. Pew Center, you can go, they're reputable too. And you look at Americans, at one point they were happy. You see it spikes up right after, in the 1990s, we prevailed in the Cold War, right? And then we get a little bit of a spike after 2001, and then it's dropped off. So 45% of Americans, this is the latest data we found, aren't very happy with where the United States is. And if you ask Americans, should the United States be the leader in global politics, take the lead, or should it just be a player? Most Americans think we should be involved, but we don't have to take the leading role at all times. Right, so we should play a major role, but not the leading role. And then the third reason after that, so Americans, not what we want writ large. Some of you may want it, but a good chunk of Americans, some don't want it at all, is that the US is now seen as a threat globally. Think about that. We are now seen as a threat globally. And so if you look at the data, we're seen as a major threat, and that's grown over time. All right, and as a minor threat, less. And as a not a threat, that's pretty consistent. Go to the next one slide, the next one. This was taken before Putin went into Ukraine the second time, or as many times in 2014, but then 2022. And this is really distressing when I saw these data. This is 53,000 people from 53 countries. And China and Russia are seen in some ways as less of a threat than the United States to democracy. And it's because we're everywhere. And what do Americans see? We have more special operators deployed than we do ambassadors around the world in countries, right? They're seeing the military force. They're not seeing the soft power of this country. And then secondarily, or the fourth reason, is adversaries and allies, we can think about Israel today, might use our militarized behavior, the way in which we engage the globe, to justify their own. So I'll just run through two of our friends. Vladimir Putin, who I will say publicly and have said it, is evil, right? But he warned us in 1999 that if we went into Kosovo without a mandate, we were going to pay for that, right? And so he was pressed by Schultz before he went into Ukraine. This is right before he goes into Ukraine, and said, "You're so mistaken. We already have war in Europe," and it happened in 1999. And so he uses it as a cudgel, and he warned us he was going to use it as a cudgel against us. So our adversaries. And then President Xi of China, we're very worried about him in Taiwan, right? And he warns about US unilateralism, that we're going to pay. And then the last reason, this is where we're wrapping up, is that we may be spending more but for less, not more. And so these are data, cost of war project at Brown University, excellent. And what this is telling you is that for every $1 million spent, the kinds of jobs you're going to get. And I think anybody driving here tonight on the roads knows that our infrastructure is terrible. But in any event, if you go and look at the data, let's go back. Oh, it keeps forwarding. So you're going to get 19, I'm an educator. So for $1 million, we can get 11 jobs. We can get 15 in education writ large and in secondary. But in defense, you're only going to get 6.9 jobs, right? So it's really important. There are trade-offs here, right? This is the whole guns and butter. So the last thing is that, you know, we're concerned, Sidita and I are sharing these data, sharing this, is that we have an inversion of what our priorities should be. And that we want to rethink our national security policy and foreign policy. And as I mentioned, I'm at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And when we teach this stuff, we talk about DIME. So diplomacy, intelligence or information, military might, and economics. And we want to put the D back, right? Think about diplomacy and information sharing. And we're not saying no use of force. Sidita is an expert on humanitarian interventions. There may be times in which you have to use force. There's no other way to deal with an opponent. But the problem is that we've become too comfortable with using it seemingly all the time. So I think I'm going to end it there, and we'll open up to questions, Mary.
Yeah, we might collect a few questions. There's no way we're going to answer all of them. We're going to try and get maybe some new questions in here tonight. And don't forget, we have our wonderful mingle period where you can work it out with your co-attendees as you purchase a book. So wait until a microphone comes around to you. We will get a couple. Please raise your hands. Yes, you right here. And then we'll go to Martin, and Nez is bringing over a mic right now. Go right ahead. It will take two at the same time.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing such fascinating research. I have a methodology question. I'm curious, when you're conducting research using presumably open source unclassified information, how do you account for inaccessible, possibly classified data like threat reporting on the high side that might in fact impact your analysis and findings pretty substantially? Thinking particularly in the context of the one slide that outlined that contrast between intervention and what appeared to be less of a trigger. And is that potentially because of intelligence reporting that shows something is imminent? But how do you account for that kind of like as a counterfactual? Thank you.
Okay, and then we'll go over and get our next question.
Hi, yes. So my question is, at risk of oversimplification, has U.S. foreign policy been militarized by the military or by the civilian side of the government? You mentioned the NSC, and so I just decided to put it out that way.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for the first question. I'll take the methodological one. It's a very important question, one that we have tried our best to mitigate, but alas, it is not possible to be perfectly able to do so. So I started off my empirical section of the presentation saying that the numbers are most likely conservative. The way that we tried our best to be as accurate and comprehensive as possible is that we didn't include a data point of U.S. intervention unless we could confirm that the intervention occurred specifically the way that we code for it in 3 separate academic sources. So we actually have a subset of data points, about 100 of them, that we don't include in these numbers because we were not able to separately confirm through 3 academic sources that they occurred the way that we're saying that they occurred. We also do have a separate data source on drone warfare, and we also have a separate data source for the frontier wars. So what you're seeing here in the graphics that I illustrated earlier is the very likely conservative estimate of U.S. military interventions across time, because we'd rather err on the side of caution than overestimate or inflate those numbers. 400 is, a pretty large number as is. So to think that it's most likely more than 400, I think is also a pretty flabbergasting claim. The way that we try our best to account for it is looking at a multitude of academic sources, so intelligence studies. We have gone as far as, 1,800 military records, aerial, naval records. Whatever source we thought would have information on U.S. military interventions, we have dug through. And in order to mitigate that risk, we have given every single one of our readers a case narrative, about a 3 to 4 page long narrative of every single case we include that lists additional sources for them. So if you guys don't trust us, right? Or if you want more information, or you're wondering about those methodological concerns, as you should be, that narrative will be a place to go. So you can see what we collected, where we collected it, and where the limits are. There's a section in the narrative, each narrative, 400 narratives, talking about data discrepancies and data limitations. So anytime there's a data limit, we list it in that narrative, so you guys are aware as well.
No, I mean, that is a great question. And what I'd say is that because of classification of data and intelligence, we have way underestimated in the more contemporary era. So it's actually worse, a lot worse than what we were able to codify. So it's already distressing enough, but as time comes forward and things get declassified, we'll see even more. As to the question about who's to blame, look, we're a democracy. We have civilian oversight of our military. I do not blame the military. The militaries can do what, they're given their orders, like, we're going to give me a plan to go into Iraq, give me a plan to go into Afghanistan. They're not the ones saying, go to Afghanistan, we need to go to Iraq, boss, right? They're responding to our civilian authority about where they need to go. And I think it goes back, I think Eisenhower was so prescient in 1961 with his farewell address, a 10-minute speech where he warned about the military-industrial complex, right? And that's that triad where you've got lobbyists, right, who are earning a lot of money, industrialists, right? You think about all the different military and industries involved, and then you have Congress. And so I think it's a leadership problem at the civilian level. Congress has abrogated its authority. The president is doing their best. We can talk about the presidency from Ronald Reagan in particular forward, where they wanted more control, more executive control, which Congress kind of allowed. And then the AUMF, that authorization for the use of military force has not been revoked, even though we could make the argument that the war on terror is done. And so in a sense, it's leadership, but we are a democracy. It's us. And we're not putting pressure on our leaders, on our representatives, on Congress, on our presidents to say, enough already. This is not where I want my tax dollars to go. I remember when the Ukraine war hit, I thought, darn, all those Western systems are going to go in there. And what is this military triad going to do? They're going to rub their hands together and say, hey, boss, the telemetry in that system wasn't great. We need to improve that. R&D money is going to funnel in, and it's just going to keep feeding the beast. And so the war in Ukraine, yes, I think we need to help them in some ways, but we're just going to keep feeding the beast if it's the case that we see the use of force is the only way to deal with our adversaries. So I don't blame the military. I blame civilians because we have civilian control.
Okay,
And
thank you. Yep.
quick, and one of the main reasons we were incentivized to make the data set publicly available for everyone is that as democratic citizens of this country, I think one of the biggest limitations is that most of us, including myself, don't necessarily know what the US is doing with its military day in and day out. We know the big stuff, but the everyday small additions to mission mandates and operations, that stuff is hard to come by. Even if you dig for it, it's hard to come by. So making the data publicly available so the average citizen is aware of how much the US is relying on its military in parts of the world we have never really heard of. I think that's the first step.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do want to try and get a bunch of questions in. Okay, we'll do Mary and you. And if we have any students in the room, I really want to get to you. So go right ahead, Mary, and then you, Karen.
Hi. How much of this, basically of the issues that we've had recently, are due to the polarization of our politics, where now you have basically Democrat and Republican, and they're not anywhere near close to one another. And you've got one guy who, the presumptive nominee, who's anti-interventionist, but depends on how he feels on that particular day and which versus which particular country. And the other is Joe Biden.
Thank you. What efforts have you made and what sources do you have for analyzing diplomatic efforts to resolve something before it escalates to military? What are your sources and your ability to make a comparison between diplomacy that maybe failed and was secret as opposed to escalating to the military? Thank you.
So the question of political polarization, wonderful question. Thank you. We delved into it and we were interestingly surprised that when we looked to see whether there was a partisan Republican versus Democrat difference in intervention frequency and intervention rate across the eras, we didn't find any. So at this moment in time, our data isn't showing any partisanship bias in whether Republican administrations or Republican versus Democrat presidents intervene at higher or lower rates. It seems to be pretty the same. So that poses the follow-up question that if it's not our partisanship, it's not some distinct administrational trend, then it is broader than that. It is the core system at play in the United States. And that is something that we definitely must delve into for future research. But right now, what I can say is that the preliminary data doesn't seem to show any partisanship differences in intervention rates, at least. Other differences definitely abound.
And on the diplomatic efforts, so this book is about the military side, so we don't go into the diplomatic as much. That'll be the next book to look at sort of what have been successful diplomatic efforts. But it goes back to that methodological problem that was raised initially, that a lot of diplomacy happens behind the scenes, track 2, track 3, and of course the high level diplomacy. But generally speaking, if you look at the timing and the amount, the rapidity, this is why Sidita's thing about the rate at which these interventions, they're happening so quickly that now we're not allowing for the diplomatic efforts to take hold, to take seed. So the next book will be and should be on looking at those diplomatic efforts to see which ones succeeded, to sell them, right? To make the case that indeed diplomacy can work.
I'm actually going to ask a question. I'm calling on myself. So I'm just wondering, for logic purposes, could it also be, in addition to all the trends that you're talking about, or have you accounted for just the changing nature of technology? In 1776, it took 6 months or a year or something to get your fleet over to the coast of Barbary or New York or whatever. And now we can send missiles around the world in minutes and hundreds of drones overnight.
It was definitely a methodological concern that we had when we did such a big foray into US history. And we do kind of lay out those limitations. I like to think that because most of our kind of escalatory military practices happen after World War II, which is when we have nuclear parity, we have those technological capabilities, that escalation is occurring despite technological shifts. I'm sure it is still being impacted by those shifts, but we also see that we had an escalation intervention after the end of the Cold War. So that alone says that, you know, technologically, there have been big changes, but Cold War was the era of US technological competition. And we see an increase in intervention rates in the 1990s, most likely due to US unipolarity, a power shift in the system, not necessarily the technological shifts that happen in between those. We have a paper that is going to be coming out soon that pinpoints that shift from the end of the Cold War until the 1990s unipolar moment. We don't see it only within one administration. We don't see it only within one decade. We see it as a whole from the shift from bipolarity to unipolarity. That seems to be doing a lot of that intervention driving. But I think Monica and I, we can agree that technological shifts are important variations and variables. And we do wish we could account more for those specifically.
You know, what I'd say, Mary, is if we look at what's happening in Ukraine today, you can also look at what's happening in Gaza. It looks a heck of a lot like World War II. right? It's siege warfare, it's asymmetric warfare, it's, you know, digging in, it's trench warfare. These are wars of attrition, which looks a lot like war. You could even go back to World War I, World War II, but World War I, you didn't really have the air power to the same way. What's interesting is we are seeing weaker sides getting systems that make it more difficult for the stronger side to prevail. And here I'm thinking about the most recent war in Azerbaijan and Armenia. It's the first time we've seen large scale swarming of drones where they just throw in so much metal, right, that it's really hard. But yet it still looked a lot like traditional warfare. So on the one hand, it seems that it's changed a lot. You know, on the other hand, it's still humans fighting and trying to stop metal from going into their body. I mean, that's really what it's about. I want to kill more of them than they can kill of me. And the United States has always had the capacity to do that exceptionally well. And then did it even better after the end of the Cold War against every other opponent, to the point where now we don't seem to have guardrails on. That might change now with some drone warfare. It might change if another state can get parity in air superiority. But on the other hand, the United States, we spend in our defense budget, what is it, 5 times more than the next 5 states underneath us. It's astonishing how much we spend. And we have the best trained, smartest, best educated military on earth. And we still didn't win in Afghanistan. It was basically a war of attrition. The Afghans were more patient, it's their homeland. They were going to fight to the bitter end. And we left.
Oh, and forgot to add methodologically that we do separate drone warfare. So the data that you see, it doesn't include only drone warfare. So we do try to account for that, for the technological shifts.
Fascinating. Okay, I know we have a question on Zoom, which we'll read. And can I get a show of hands also, just so I get a sense in our remaining minutes? We got a couple. Okay. All right. We'll take a question from Zoom. Who's going to read that? Natalie Harrison, Naz. Okay.
This question is from Mark Schneider. How can Congress reassert its constitutional war authority? What are the headwinds preventing this?
Back to Mary, right? And polarization, right? So I think that is part of it, right? That polarization. We can think about, again, back to the war in Afghanistan, where, remember, President Bush, George W. Bush, went into Iraq in 2003, and people thought that Afghanistan was the good war and Iraq was the bad war. So then when the Obama administration comes in, his administration used Afghanistan as the good war against the bad war of the Bush administration. And that's at the executive level. And so Congress, because it is so polarized, there isn't leadership there. The Foreign Services Committee and because they do a lot of strategizing too in the Senate and the House. So I do think it's inhibited. Leadership. I mean, I think we've got to. I was hoping during COVID there would be a coming together of this nation. How naive was I, right? Look at how that became so hyper politicized just about whether to wear a mask or not in this country. And so now we want to move to the next level of talking about where should our defense dollars, where should our budgets, you know, the defense budget is one of the few fungible elements of our budget, of our federal budget. And it's just easier, cheaper in a weird way. It's just easier to keep ramping it up and not make those hard decisions. And that would require leadership. And to his credit, President Biden had the courage to say, Afghanistan's not going anywhere well soon. Obama didn't have the courage, Trump didn't have the courage, and Bush didn't have the courage to pull back out of Afghanistan. It took President Biden, who did not want to go in, by the way. He warned his boss, Obama, this is not going to work, back when Obama was doing his surge in 2007-08, and for him to recognize that it wasn't working. So leadership, we have a deficit of leadership in this nation. And so in Congress, we need people, but as you know, we're in a very hyper-polarized moment in this country, which is making it difficult because people who are rational, who want to actually legislate, do we have a Congress that legislates? Not really, right? Now we've just got this Ukraine package and Israel package through, but it's going to require some sound mind and leaders who are willing to take a risk for us to get to some sort of sanity on this.
Okay, all right, so who else did we have? So we'll take you and Raul and the gentleman in the corner.
Thank you. As a disclaimer, I worked for the State Department for 33 years, so I'm well aware of the role of the military in U.S. foreign policy. But what strikes me as unusual in recent times is the role of the intelligence agencies, and particularly the role that they played in Ukraine. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Okay, and then we'll go over to the corner down there.
Thank you. On one of your slides, you showed a comparison or an alignment between a misalignment between kind of the use of force and the level of interest, what the interest was, whether it was in our interest. And there was a distinct difference in the last two eras. Yes, this one. I was wondering if you could talk more about the criteria you used. How did you define the national interest, and talk more about the index and how you applied that, and if you could give a couple examples.
Thank you. And I've been told I need a new prescription, which I definitely do. Sorry. And then we'll round up with a question from Raul.
Thank you.
We've got a few minutes.
Just a comment. Dime without strategy is worthless. So keep that in mind, because it's not taught as dime anymore. It's taught underlying strategy. Okay. Secondly, about who spends money for what. Most of the time that I spent 20 years in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places of interest in the world, I was working on State Department projects funded by the Defense Department. So it's not fair to say that the Defense Department is spending all this money when a good bit of it is actually subsidizing the State Department, which is always out without enough money. Okay, now the question. Really, in the use of military force, there usually are two imperatives for any use of military force. One is protect the force. So there's an amount of order that has to be brought to bear. And the second is usually training somebody else. Now, the training somebody else turns out, unfortunately, usually to be in our image. And maybe that's not the right image. But that you should examine as well as you look at the roots of why we haven't done so well.
Okay, let's pick up a question from Ed real quick, because you're right there, Nez, and then we'll do a grand summation.
How much especially after World War II, how much of our intervention around the world was motivated by the necessity of certain natural resources that we need? I think oil is the one you think mostly, but there's other ones too.
Yeah, so the intelligence agency. So what's interesting about this project is that I would make the case that all of the services, all of the sort of the civil services have become more militarized. So the intelligence agencies they're sort of helping to doing the bidding. We now have the Department of Homeland Security. We basically have an interior ministry. Think about that. We never had that in this country. And our Department of Veterans Affairs are not included in these data. So anybody read The $1 Trillion War by Linda Bilmes and Joseph Stiglitz? They underestimated that they think it's actually $3 trillion because of the damage that was done to our soldiers on the ground in the wars, the global wars on terror, because of head trauma. So my response is that if we start thinking about the intelligence communities, what they were doing, we all know what they did in Iraq, right? And in fact, if you go to Afghanistan again, I'm doing this big project on Afghanistan. To its credit, intelligence communities and special operators defeated the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They were defeated by December 7th, 2001. Absolutely defeated, routed, pushed into the tribal areas of Pakistan, yet we stayed there for another 20 years. It was 100 troops on horseback with really good intelligence who defeated them, yet we stayed there for another. It's so depressing reading this stuff thinking, why? Why didn't somebody say, let's spend this money in a better way? Anyway, yeah. Well, anyway, so what I would say is that we've militarized almost, and you can think about American society. Look at the equipment. Remember when we just had the Boston Marathon, and I live in Cambridge, and Watertown is right next door. Do you remember the armored personnel carriers? What is that? It's a community in Watertown and a kid hiding in a boat. Yes, he did a horrific act right here. Absolutely horrific, but it was a criminal act. It was criminal. It wasn't a militarized act. So in any event, that's a long answer to that question. I'm trying to think, Raul, your question was who speaks, what was it? Who speaks for,
Take into account the tasks that are being performed.
yeah,
It's not just killing
Sure.
people and breaking things, it's also trying to train them.
yes.
And you know, if you don't like what happened in Afghanistan,
Hmm.
you must realize that most of the trainers were not Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, and then Sidita, you do want to answer the,
I'll answer the National Interest Index. That's okay. So this is our initial attempt to try to quantify the interests involved in U.S. military interventionism across the decades. And what goes into the index is an additive index. We have a ordinal variable that measures the alliance type between the U.S. and the target country. So are they in some form of an alliance? Is it a defensive alliance? Is it some other form of an alliance? Are they contiguous? So is the U.S., does it share a border with the country that it's intervening within? If it does share a border, how many borders? Is it, how far away? So contiguity measures, some are dichotomous, some are ordinal. We also have a measure of formal colonial status. So was the U.S. ever a colony of, or did it ever serve as the colonial power over the territory? Because that is a proxy variable for previous strategic interests. If the U.S. colonized one part of the world historically, then it has strategic historical interests in that part of the world. And we also, of course, code for oil supply. So is the country the U.S. intervening upon, is it a major oil exporter? Yes or no? And then other natural resources, mineral and other natural resources, the percentage of mineral and natural resource rents in that specific target country. So our national interests, again, they're not perfect. They are a quantitative measure, so they can't include everything, but they do code for the standard geopolitical dimensions of how close are you? Have you had an alliance with this country? Is there former strategic interests through prior colonial possession? And what about oil, natural, and mineral resources? And a few others in there that I can delve into later.
Thank you. Wow. I think, so we'll have a couple of announcements, but first, I know that we should thank our authors very much for being with us. So the good news is we have until 7:30 to buy books and to continue on this fascinating topic. Please be with us next week, April 29th, and May 2nd for Great Decisions and Chat and Chowder. And because I got my notes tangled up, I forgot at the top to mention that we, of course, greet all of our community members who are celebrating Passover. And on this Earth Day, we say, thanks, friend. This is a nice planet. So thanks for being with us tonight. See you again soon.